Hello, this is Steven out, and yes, we're back with the television series review. This is part 2 to the Sopranos TV show review, so without any further ado, let's hop straight into this review. Season with the episode For All Debts Public and Private. Now, around this time, unfortunately, the unfortunate and tragic incident of 9/11 happened, the tower attacks at the time. So what the show did, it incorporated that into the show, but it also basically saying incorporated how that event changed America's life. So in this season sets a really dark tone, more so than the previous ones, and how it was going to go further into dark tone, but also a little bit of a dark aesthetic kind as we go on, but that would be more pronounced in season 5 and 6 than it is in season 4. But we also get how the mob is actually in decline of money, how they're not kicking up. So Tony is basically going around and trying to get, his guys to really kick up more money. Also, Junior is having problems with his legal troubles because he needs money for it. It's also here in this episode where, again, it's been pronounced really in past seasons, but, Carmela and Furio are having, not an affair, but developing an attraction to one another, especially on Carmela's side. And Furio is definitely too. Another thing is, we also hear is the relationship with Tony and Christopher this time around. As here, Tony is trying to groom Christopher to become his, not heir apparent, but also to become a bit more of the future with the family, as Tony's worry of, of either ending up in debt or in the can. So he's trying to, set up, not just to take it back, but also in this episode, he's hiding a lot of his money in certain places. And again, in this episode, Tony goes, basically Christopher, the man who possibly killed his father, a crooked cop who's retired, no longer useful. It's still left into interpretation, even when at the time when the episode came out, if this guy did really kill Christopher's father. But it's still unclear, really, at the end of the episode. But I do like how, there is some possibility, but there is some doubt, and I kind of like they go into that. The next episode following with Christopher's story is how he's a capo, well, acting capo with Paulie in the can. And this causes a bit of friction because some of the guys felt like he doesn't deserve the position because it should be someone who's honestly a bit more wiser or has done a lot more work for the family, who's been in the family a lot longer than Christopher. People feel that Patsy should be given the job, but it doesn't happen. Also here, in this season, and I think around this episode, we get to Adriana introduces her friend Danielle, who turns out to be really an FBI undercover agent. And during the season, not Carmela, sorry, Adriana gets exposed by the FBI, becomes basically an informant, or forced to be. Also in the season, for a while, Janice and Ralph try to form a relationship, because after the last season, Ralph left Jackie's mother. But in this season, he essentially begins to briefly date Janice, but the relationship quickly falls apart. Also here in this episode, and we also here get to see how Meadow is, how she's basically falling apart after the death of Jackie Jr. She's going through a tailspin, and this is great scene when she's in a room and Carmela's yelling at Meadow for essentially not paying attention in school, or college, I should say, not paying attention in college, to year off. They just basically, it's just a great scene, because the reason why it's such a great scene, not only because of that, even Tony's backing up Carmela, saying, Carmela's right, but once Meadow says, "Look at you, Mr. Mob Boss," Tony stands up, goes to her face, doesn't yell, but is getting really intimidated, really intimidating her, and basically saying, that he really did care for Jackie more than his own old man. God rest his soul. I kind of like when he said that line because it shows that Tony, out of all the guys in the crew, he probably missed Jackie, Jackie Senior the most because they were friends and probably because he was more really the person who should, be really more in charge, in charge of the, really in charge of the Soprano family and not him. Maybe all this craziness he got involved in wouldn't have happened. In the next episode, Christopher... Now, this is an episode that's very... I wouldn't say hated, but it basically was this kind of protest with Native Americans who wanted to denounce, like, Columbus Day, the Columbus Day rally, courtesy of, how they were given the stereotype of being Italian Americans, of Italian Americans, like, use Christopher Columbus as an icon, but he's really a slave trader. So you get kind of that. It's really a pointless episode, honestly. I'm not a really huge fan of it, and I really wish it was just not in the thing at all. The next episode to follow, a storyline that unfolds here is while Paul is in prison, he gets word of a joke that was said courtesy of Ralph, who of course is a bit of a loudmouth, and contrary to the last season where Ralph and Johnny Sack are on good terms, Paulie reveals to Johnny Sack that basically this joke of Ginny's weight, and this angers Johnny, and you can see there's a bit of resentment when he's with Ralph for quite a long time throughout the season, and most especially with Paulie being in really close proximity with Johnny Sack, reveals some certain things that he shouldn't to the New York family, who wants to get more of a lucrative piece in a New Jersey lucrative business that they got going on. So it's very interesting they go with that route. Also here during these episodes, unfortunately, Bobby Babliecki's wife unfortunately dies in a terrible car accident. It's a really sad moment for Bobby because he's a gangster and he is a criminal, but compared to all the other guys in the crew, he's arguably not the meanest, not the scariest. Yeah, he's like he's kind of like I said, he's really a teddy bear who just happens to be a gangster. We also here in the season we get introduced to Pyromite. You see, Ralph has invested in a lucrative horse which Tony it becomes very attached to and lucrative, but eventually Ralph leaves the horse to have Tony look after it more because he's finding out Tony's just getting profits off the horse while it's not really helping really look after it or groom it. It's really Ralph doing all the work. And this goes to show that, despite Tony's faults, he has a love for animals and certainly a love, and again, he, is very protective and loves kids. Kids, doesn't want to see them get hurt. So, again, Tony is not that cruel, but this season, it's just in I think season 2 did, and especially season 3, there's a bit of a decline in Tony becoming more of a criminal. Not criminal, but it's becoming devolving into almost a little bit of a monster or a selfish scumbag. Also in this season, Janice actually moves on to, tries to form a relationship with Bobby and tries to marry him in this season. Bobby is definitely feeling hurt, with his wife gone, but he's trying to move on, but of course it's hard for him. And by the end of the season, him and Janice become a thing, and sadly next season they will be married, but that's next season's storyline. The Johnny Sack joke goes to a head when, Johnny Sack, after being drunk, ends up bashing a member of Ralph's crew, almost into a coma. Tony is upset, but once he hears the reason why believing in this joke, it's going to come to a head. As Johnny Sack is actually asking Carmine Lupatazzi, who is the head of the Lupatazzi family, and Johnny Sack is the number 2 guy in the family, to essentially to get a hit okayed on Ralph. The reason because of that joke. Carmine wants to get some money out of it, believing that if they could, for this insult, they could get some cash out of it, but Johnny Sack really doesn't want to hear it. They even try to have a sit-down over it, but Johnny Sack does not want an apology. He views that whole thing as sailed. And this is what we see what makes, I think, Johnny Sack and Bobby different to other mobsters, as they're the only few in the series, of course you can name a few others, but really they're one of the only few in the series to be a one-man guy. They were happily married, they are faithful to their wives, and they don't want to be like this player type of persona that the others are. So basically, eventually this just gets further. This just gets further out of control, and it just. Eventually, Johnny does decide to put the debt away, move on, and that's mostly because of his wife, because he finds out, because this season, it's clear that his wife is trying to lose weight, and despite her being a bit fat, for him, he doesn't care. She is beautiful what she is, and sees the struggles. Eventually, when she finds out she's been, secretly been having this chocolate stash, because like she said, she's trying to lose weight for him because of how the other wives are. Johnny Sack is, of course, I'd say impressed by this, or flattered by this, but he says to her straight up, I don't care. I love you for just the way you are. And I think that makes probably Johnny Sack one of the most interesting, because the high position he has, this is his wife. Not the typical traditional mob wife you'd expect to get. So I kind of like that. It does subvert expectations. Another storyline that comes in this season is Christopher's heroin addiction. It gets to the point where eventually he has to have an intervention, and he essentially gets sent to rehab. Now, in the mob, if you were a gangster that got really hooked on cocaine or anything, or heroin, whatever, you get whacked immediately. They would not send you to, they would not give you an intervention. They would not do this rehab thing, but hey, because he's Tony's nephew, they probably give him a pass on that. Other interesting things, again, with this season is, of course, the deterioration between Ralph and Tony. It was clear in season 3 that honestly, Tony and Ralph weren't really the type to get along, and this is cultivated courtesy through the horse Pyomide that Tony's developed a fondness for. And this happens courtesy of a fire that destroys the barn that the horse is in and kills it. Tony believes Ralph did it for the insurance money, but also in that same episode in which the horse unfortunately dies, Ralph's son gets into an accident and is in hospital, and he breaks down. It's also here where he goes to apologize to, Jackie Jr.'s mother for, for not being there for her during her lowest. You really see how, not only humble, he's changed it a bit. We sympathize for the devil almost for a little bit. So I kind of like that. But this eventually leads to, of course, Tony believing Ralph killed the horse. It's still not confirmed in the show if he did, but I think David Chase confirmed it later that he did kill the horse. And essentially, what happens is, Tony's rage ends up killing Ralph. Ralph is dead, suspended, killed, but they try to spread the rumor that New York might have taken Ralphie out, courtesy of the joke. In this season, we got Paulie's character, who is, we see a trait how he is. He's a weasel. He's not a rat, but he, believes he's highly loved in the New York family, but he finds out he's really not. So he tries to get back. So he, goes back in good graces with Tony and the crew. So there's that kind of storyline. I know it's not that big. I haven't really talked about it that much, but I felt that it does play a pivotal role in the story. Another storyline we need to get back to is the tension with a little bit of the New Jersey and New York family. Something that will become really more prevalent in the last 2 seasons, but it kind of begins here. This is because Johnny Sack is working with Tony to get Carmine hit so he could take over. At first, Tony was going to go along with it before he calls it off. Eventually, Tony and Lupatazzi, they all come to an agreement to settle their difference once and for all and put this kind of rivalry to bed. It's done. Gone. So I kind of like we went with that. And again, and the tension that Tony and Johnny Sack had in this season, some of it will spill into the next seasons. Another thing we also need to wrap up with the storyline with this season is the Furio and Carmella storyline. In this season, again, it's Carmella and Furio are developing an attraction for one another. And this gets to a bit of but what happens with Furio this season, after he went back to Italy for a funeral for his father, he reveals to an uncle that, that he's in love with the boss's wife, and they tell him, don't pursue it, what will happen. As Furio comes back, he feels alienated with America. He can't fit in here, and he loves for Carmella, but he also begins to despise and be disgusted by Tony. He even tried to kill Tony, but stopped himself before he could. Eventually, Furio just gets up and leaves, never to return, and Furio leaves the series in this season, with Carmella heartbroken that she's gone. It really affects her, especially how she takes it out. A little bit out on Meadow, a little bit, and even to an extent on AJ. When that happens. This, of course, then leads to an ultimate bad moment where Tony, one of Tony's mistresses, ends up calling the house. Carmella hears, and it leads to arguably one of the greatest confrontations between Carmella and Tony in the series. That's the scene alone, with that kind of, thing happening. I think it happens in the final episode, is arguably a great scene that won both actors an Emmy. It's a really great scene because it's the two, how Carmella confesses how he loved Furio, and it's just wow. It's a great scene. It's so much tension, and the actors with the dialogue. It's one of the most captivating scenes. And scenes like that, and a lot of scenes like that, and storylines like this makes, honestly, for me, Season 4 my favorite season of The Sopranos. I like it because of its a little bit of a dark tone it begins to develop that will pass on into the next season, but also with these types of storylines, it's captivating. There's mob politics, the people are double-crossing, they are scheming, a lot of great things are coming out this season, and that's what makes Season 4 my personal favorite. We end the season with essentially Carmella and Tony separated. Tony leaves, giving Carmella the house, and Tony essentially goes and crashes, I think it's at Ari's place. Oh, I want to know what storyline was happening with Ari this season. Well, he has his ups and downs, but again, out of all of Tony's friends, he loves Ari because he's not a mobster. He's a regular Joe, and out of all his friendships he's had in the series, he always values that the most. And I kind of like that, that we get that. Anyway, so that's Season 4. Arguably the best season in the show. A lot of fans that I've read on the internet, they proclaim this is their favorite season and the best season. I agree. It's one of my favorites. Again, I'm not sure if that is 100% true, but I like to think it is. I really enjoy this season. It's an absolute delight, and arguably, I think this is where, once you hit this season and it ends, it goes downhill, not in storyline, but more in character and how they devolve. But that's kind of the point. The characters are just going to get worse and worse from here, and it's written to the storyline where they're supposed to be, and we experience a lot of characters downfall in the last two seasons. And speaking of that, let's get into Season 5. Season 5, people say this is where the quality of the series dropped, but I disagree. For me, my enjoyment of the series really elevated in Season 5. Again, I enjoyed all the seasons, but for me, Season 5, I consider it very, very underrated. The storyline for this season is, well, first off, in the first episode, it's establishing that some members of organized crime are currently getting out of prison. Some for the New York scene, specifically the Lupatazzi family, and a few guys for New Jersey. This included a character, Feach LaMarta, played by Robert Loggia, who was basically an old school guy. We know who Feach LaMarta is. He was actually name dropped, I believe, in season 3, and he's an original guy. Tony has a bit of a past with him, courtesy of a card game that Jackie Sr., and I believe Silvio hold up, card robbery him. But because of the fact of Jackie's brother and Tony's father and uncle being made men in the New York crew, essentially they escaped with no harm. But this helped essentially have Tony become and Jackie, become made men in the mob. But Tony's really more concerned that another person from the New Jersey crew is getting out of prison, Tony Blundetto, Tony B, his cousin. There's a bit of an interesting history, backstory, where basically this Tony, was basically a protege to Feach LaMarta and was very much under him. But eventually there was a bust, which Tony was supposed to be there, but because of a panic attack, he didn't. Tony was caught and sent to prison, and basically his life went to hell. Wife divorced him, daughter ran away, hasn't been seen, so basically he was at rock bottom. And I really like Tony Blundetto as a character, not only because he's played by Steve Buscemi, who is a fantastic actor and one of my favorites. If I ever get the chance to, in my opinion, to either write or direct something, again, I don't see that happening in my lifetime, but if I could, I would love to work with that actor. He is just phenomenal in anything he does. But basically, he gets out, and Tony wants to welcome him into the family and have him, earn his keep. Give him a living. But Tony doesn't. He, for the very much of it, actually wants to stay out and make an honest living of himself. What I find interesting is that he doesn't look like a traditional wise guy. And that's, I think, why I liked him so much, because this would be the last guy you would expect to be, a good fellow, a gangster, and I like him. Feach LaMarta, first off, Robert Loggia, a fantastic actor. I best remember him from this, even though he appeared in Scarface. But for me, I just like how he is very much of the old school mob. He is from a completely different generation, who believed in when you were caught, you shut up, you keep your mouth quiet, and you do your time. Now, Tony, is very hesitant to work with Feach LaMarta. First off, he has great respect for him, as he has always quoted, he is a living legend. But he has great trouble, hesitant to work with him, not only because of the card game thing, but because he's seen what happened with guys like Richie Aprile, sorry. When he got out, he didn't really work with Tony, but, because Feach LaMarta is a living legend, he agrees. Now, this is something I noticed that the series began to repeat quite a bit. A former member of the mob getting out and causing some problems for Tony. They don't really fit in well. And as much as I love this character, I feel they are repeating that trope a bit. But unfortunately, Feach LaMarta doesn't stick around for much. Because eventually, unfortunately, he was essentially arrested and sent to prison, courtesy of Tony setting up the whole thing, rather than killing him because he was a legend. Tony kind of feels, I think, a little bit of guilt, but he realizes he has to in order to really protect himself, but he claims for the family, but really it's not. Other things happen this season. Now, this is where, really where AJ, Tony's son, becomes more of the, the whiny guy that everyone hates. Or, consider one of the worst TV characters. Again, I don't really consider, I'm just considering him as a kid. I mean, true, he's not the best, but I think the reason he acts like he is because of his upbringing. And definitely how he was raised, definitely played a bit of a role in how he became. But, yeah, this is where that stereotype came into play. This season, Meadow, I believe, dates Finn, Finn was really in the last season, but here, there's a bit of a character development where, actually, Meadow kind of eventually marries. It's a bit of a long story to how this is, but I don't really think that important as the overall review, as it's something you should watch for yourself, because it intertwines a little bit with Tony's story. And it's also the season where we find out in an episode, I believe it's this season, of a minor character, Vito, a member of the, Sopranos family, crime of the New Jersey crime family. We find out he's gay, and this would have repercussions really in the next season. Other characters that kind of get a bit of a character moving forward in this season is Carmela. I mean, she tries to basically try to be, kind of independent woman, but really she is afraid of working, afraid of being on her own. And again, Tony and Carmela go through a bit of a divorce, are definitely going through a separation this season. They get back together for a bit, or try to, but Carmela goes back to trying to divorce him. But eventually they do, get back together. And it is a really interesting storyline. But I'm really glad that, that we get to see they really do have us dissect the toxic relationship these two have, despite the fact there is a genuine love between the two. But it's also clear that, this mob lifestyle, Carmela kind of acts like a hypocrite. She wants to be, to stand on her own, to be this tough, independent woman, but really, she is unable to commit. She's unable to actually get up and work. So that kind of falls for it. Also this season, Tony and Chris's relation go through a bit of a decline. This was courtesy of a rumor that got spread that he might be, having an affair with Adriana. Of course, it is a fabricated, of course, it's a lie, because it's just the classic case of Chinese whispers, and it definitely does get out of control. What also happens, also happens this season from the New York side, because New York actually gets much more involved both in this season and the next season. In this season, Carmine Lupitazzi Sr., the boss of the Lupitazzi family, one of the 5 New York family boss, dies courtesy of a heart attack, just as he's having lunch at a golf course with Tony, Johnny Sack himself, and another member of the Lupitazzi family who just happens to have gotten out, his former consigliere. He dies of a heart attack. And this is one of the few times you can really see he's one of those few gangsters who, this is how I'm pretty sure all gangsters want to die. They want to die in old age, really not in prison, not at the hands of a gun. And this kind of reminds me of really Carlo Gambino in real life, who died. Of course, he didn't die, in the early 2000s. He died way back, I think it was in 1976, if I recall correctly. Correct me if I'm wrong down in the comments. But basically, when he dies, there's a power vacuum. Naturally, the guy to take over is, of course, Johnny Sack, who was his underboss and was next in line. And he has some support courtesy of Leotardo, who was a capo who just got out of prison, played, of course, by Frank Vincent. If you're looking for an actor who screams wise guy, you got him. Leotardo basically is the old school mob who believes in loyalty, all that shtick, and he backs Johnny Sack along with his brother Bill, who is also, backing up who's also backing up Johnny Sack. But there's a rival with another person to take over the family. This is, of course, Carmine Lupitazzi Jr. We met him, I think it was the last season, or maybe the season before that. And basically, he is backed up not only by the consigliere, but another guy in the family. But basically, the guy he's trying to use Carmine as a bit of a puppet to have him, take the hits to run the family through, so manipulating him. So now there's a power vacuum, there's a bit of a Cold War type thing. And for the most part, New Jersey stays out of it. But because things are getting out of control, eventually the consigliere actually goes to Tony Blundetto, Tony B. It turns out the two were best friends in the can, and actually Tony B looks up to the guy. In fact, there's a very strong friendship there. And if looking, and this, despite Tony B's faults, he is absolutely loyal, especially to his friends. So, but for the most part, just like Tony Soprano, he stays very much out of the war, or of the conflict. He wants to remain neutral. The only reason he got involved is courtesy of a few things. One, he's trying to make an honest living, but, the hard work gets to him, and he is tempted to get back into the life, not only for the quick cash, but noticing, his family. Even though he's no longer married, his daughter's gone. He has 2 sons, and I think is dating a girlfriend or has a wife. I'm not entirely sure. I believe it's not. But, desperate times. Desperate times. And eventually he is pushed and does a hit, resulting in the death of a guy that was supporting Johnny Sack. And this kind of is forced to bring, New Jersey into the war, because rumors is that he did it, even though Tony Soprano basically says, no, we were not involved in this at all. And the tension is getting worse and worse, and this culminates with Johnny Sack whacking the consigliere. This enrages Tony B and goes on a rampage and kills Phil Leotardo, that was the first name, Phil Leotardo's brother Bill. This then results in basically Tony B having to go into hiding, but this ultimately has both a good and a bad thing. As Carmine realizes that's what's the point, and he backs down, giving the reins to Johnny Sack to be the head of the family. But Johnny Sack needs to, support Phil Leotardo, and basically Tony B is a dead man. He's in hiding, but Tony does not want to give him up, because he's family, the guys risk so much for him. So all this is going on. Another interesting storyline that actually occurred this season, I'm surprised I've taken this long to explain this, but it involves the story of, Bobby Bacchiacchi, who, of course, was a member. We've seen him in season 2, 3, and 4. He's a minor character, but now he's married to Janice and has a daughter with him. And now, he's basically Tony's brother-in-law. So this kind of a bit of a story and the relationship between Tony and he will get developed a little bit this season, and especially next season. So yeah, that's a bit of a thing. And also, another story I need to talk about is Junior's story. It is hinted, basically, he gets Alzheimer's, and his brain slowly devolves. This is especially when it gives us arguably one of the most memed lines of the entire series, is basically and was actually a line that was said way back in the very first episode, where, where Tony explained about his uncle. And Uncle Junior basically says, the line that, Tony never had the makings of a varsity athlete. We've seen this memed several times, and, it is funny. It is funny. And again, but Junior's brain is basically deteriorating, and he's definitely got Alzheimer's, and this would have repercussions, especially in the next season. During the war, and basically, now let's get back to the main story. Tony B. Tony basically does give up his location, but he goes to Tony B's location and shoots him. Shoots him dead. Blank. And this doesn't really sort things out, but eventually Tony does go to Johnny Sack to work out a peace agreement. And just when they got an arrangement or fixed things, Tony sees the FBI coming and he bolts quick into the other direction. Unfortunately, Johnny Sack is arrested by the FBI, but Tony manages to get away and gets back home. By the end of the season, he's fixed his relationship with Carmela. Things are getting, at least slowly starting to get things back together. There was actually a storyline in the season where Tony tries to pursue a romantic relationship with Dr. Melfi. And Dr. Melfi is attracted to him, but she views it as it's unprofessional and refuses to pursue the relationship. Now, I really like this season because, first off, I like how the lighting is. It feels like we're getting a bit darker and more depressing, which I kind of like the direction, because it's just showing how American life is getting more depressing, more dark, and I really like the direction it's going. I don't know, this season is just fun for me, because I think it balances both the light and the dark side. Again, I believe season 4 is definitely still the favorite, but this is definitely a close second. It's very underrated season for my liking, and it should be remembered as honestly a really great season. It's a fantastic one. Tony B was a great character. I really like him, and I'm sad to see him go, but I really like how we're given a character that is parallel to Tony. Both, first off, they look drastically different, but they do have a kind of sympathetic side that we can't help but want to root for them and, even support them, even though they're not the best of people. So I kind of like that. And again, this is probably due to the fact they're played by phenomenal great actors. And basically, yeah, that's all I've got to say. Season 5, absolutely underrated season, and I think a personal favorite, and definitely a personal favorite. Not number 1, that will definitely go to Season 4, but Season 5, definitely a good season. But now, let's get into the show's final season. Season 6 of the show, I guess it's kind of divided by fans. First off, I think it's probably the darkest season of the series has to offer, but the reason why it's controversial is because I think it's, in my opinion, is where the show just got too dark for my personal... Not too dark, it stretched for too long. As this is the longest season, as there's 2 parts, to the point where people consider, like, the first half Season 6 and the second half of the season, a Season 7. But for all intents and purposes, this is Season 6 for me. And even I agree, Season 6 is probably my least favourite because it dragged a bit too long, but there are some really enjoyable episodes of the season that even I enjoy. First off, what's happening this season with Tony and his family? Well, believe it or not, the first half of the season focuses on the possibility of Tony's redemption. We begin the season with, during the first episode, or at the end of the first episode, Tony getting shot by an Alzheimer's-induced junior who ends up shooting Tony, and Tony is sent to hospital, where he essentially goes through what is, I presume, is the afterlife, or a mental state, courtesy of him being shot and in hospital. And as a result of that, the family, both his blood family and, of course, his crime family, all coming around trying to help him out. And here we get to see just how selfish and self-centered some characters are. I forgot to mention this because the character died in the last season, but Adriana died, courtesy of Christopher finding out of her informant status, and they plan to run away, but he sells her out, and she dies. I think it was either the last season or this season, but we get that thing out of the way to further Chris's downward character this season. During this time, again, Tony tries to redeem himself with a new lease on life, but it's not working, as his old habits just won't go away. And this is where we come to the realization: Tony can't be redeemed. There is no redemption. He does fix his relationship with Carmilla, but it's still that that tension in the room that is still an on again, off again. Another thing we also find out this season, AJ, again, he's doing college, he's going down a downward spiral. Eventually he suffers depression and actually tries to kill himself. But he is saved by Tony, believe it or not, at the last minute, who saves him from drowning, and he is put in a recovery thing. Another thing I find interesting this season is Junior's character. Again, the Alzheimer's was a interesting way to take his character, but in this season he doesn't appear that much in many episodes. In fact, he ends up in after this incident of shooting Tony, he ends up in a mental institution where actually AJ tries to kill Uncle Junior courtesy of what he did to Tony. But it fails. But basically, Junior at some point ends up getting beaten up by the inmates I'm not saying inmates, but the people of the institution, and is criticalized. And we won't see him until really the final episode of the season. Another thing we get this season is what's going on in New York. Johnny Sack is locked up, doing time, and as a result, he has Phil Leotardo take his orders and becomes kind of the acting boss. Eventually, at some point, he does unfortunately pass away, courtesy of smoking. Something that I've actually picked up doing. My mum's not happy about it. But with this happening, there's now once again another power vacuum in the Lupitazzi family. A guy by the name of Doc tries to take over, but Phil Leotardo steps up to the plate and kills him, and becomes the boss. Again, this comes in really late at the season, more at the end, but it's still a thing. Believe it or not, Phil Leotardo's character we get to follow a bit of his character really this season. As just like Tony, he too had a medical thing result in going to hospital, and they try to have a new lease on life, a reappreciation, but unfortunately it ultimately results in them going back to their criminal ways. Another thing we also get this season is what Chris tries to do this season, as he essentially tries. Basically, he follows a passion that he's had in previous seasons, which is movie making, and he teams up with Little Carmine, in the previous season, and they make a movie called The Cleaver, which becomes a big hit. This season, he and Tony's relationship very much deteriorates badly and rapidly. Of course, he does eventually get married, or remarried, gets married, because he never, if I recall correctly, never did properly marry Adriana. They were constantly fiancéed, so it just took him a while for him to finally marry someone. And of course, he has a daughter and becomes a family man. And again, he has this sobriety thing, he gave up the booze, gave up the drugs, but eventually he relapses courtesy of everyone treating him around. And this was something he had to struggle with really in the last season. Another thing we get this season is Bobby's character. In previous seasons, even though he was a gangster, he was pretty much, I would call, a gangster that's really a teddy bear. He wouldn't harm a fly. But unfortunately, with him married to Janice and him kind of a little bit of responsibility to what happened to Tony, even though it was not his fault, but it sort of is. I mean, you have to watch to really understand. But he's wants to rise further in the crime family, and eventually, by the time we get close to the end of the season, he becomes essentially in the inner circle, the top three guys. There's Tony, there's him, and Silvio. Essentially, Bobby is the underboss, on top of being brother-in-law. I guess because he's learned stuff from Tony, but also from Junior. And he is a likable guy. In fact, we get one of the most iconic episodes of the season, which I think is called Home Movies, if I recall correctly. This was courtesy and Sopranos Home Movies. That was the episode. What happens here, basically, in this episode, because it's a personal favorite of mine, basically, it ties into the events of what happened in season 5. At the end of season 5, Tony on the run, he drops his gun, the authorities find the gun, he goes court, but it gets dismissed. So Tony and Bobby go out to a getaway where Bobby, Tony, Carmela, and Janice just having time of their lives. Eventually, it results in a fight between Bobby and Tony, and Bobby wins the fist fight. And we're worried Bobby's finally going to get killed, because Tony's killed people for less. But Tony punishes him by having him do something that he doesn't want to do. Kill someone. Especially since it's revealed that Bobby got into the life without actually popping anyone, without killing anyone. Another thing we get this season, first off, we really follow the story of Vito Spatafori. The character I've mentioned was a few times. Well, basically, we follow the story of his gayness, of him being gay. Eventually, it gets out. He's gay. He's in hiding, but he comes back to New York. I find this interesting that they did a character with a gay, him being gay and in the mob, because I was always curious how the mob actually treated people who were gay. And of course, it's frowned upon. I always thought this might have been based a little bit off Nick Skabelic, who I believe was Sammy the Bull's brother-in-law, and it was hinted he may have been gay. But according to what I did a bit of research, I was actually an acting boss of the New Jersey crime family that was gay, and he got gunned down when it found out that he was engaged in certain activities that you shouldn't be when in the mob. Of course, I don't know if that was what encouraged this storyline, but I kind of like it that we got this storyline. And of course, we find out how the mob views gays. Tony doesn't give a damn about a person's sexuality or, all that. But some of the guys are more old school, and they know that he has to go, to protect the family honor. And it's especially his worst since Vito's wife happens to be the cousin of Phil Leotardo. So now he's dragged into this conflict a bit. Tony doesn't want Vito killed because he doesn't care that he's gay, but also because he is one of the biggest earners in the family, and he doesn't want to get rid of his big earner. So we kind of get that. Again, also, another storyline I really liked was the Christopher and Tony storyline. That has been pretty much a main thing throughout the series. And eventually, it ends in pretty much Christopher's death. What happens is they're driving away one night, and the car crashes. Christopher reveals to Tony that he's, that he wouldn't pass a drug. He's on thing right now. And Tony sees at the back of the car the baby crib that, that carries his daughter, and he kills Christopher. Everyone's sad for her death, but Tony is very hesitant about death. He can't handle mourning. So we kind of get that going forward. Again, this is probably one of the darkest moments Tony has ever done on the show. And I think it really solidifies him being really the gangster that he is. Again, there's really not much to talk about this season, as really those are some of the clip notes. I'm sure there's more, like Tony going through a gambling addiction around this point, which results, in basically destroying a friendship with Hesh, who was obviously one of his great really one of his guys that he was really associated with. Another story is, of course, the conflict between New Jersey and New York. It had been building really since they got involved a little bit during the last season. But with Phil Leotardo in charge, eventually he's had it. This was courtesy of him swearing never to compromise, especially on business. And because really New Jersey is a smaller crew, while Lupatazzi's are a bit bigger, and when Phil Leotardo takes over the family, he finally decides to wipe out the New Jersey crew. But they only target Tony, Bobby, and Silvio, and they say they would deal with the rest. This then results in them going to war with their family. First, Tony actually tries to kill Leotardo, but misses badly, resulting in them having to force to go underground. But two members are unfortunately hit. One is Bobby, who actually is unfortunately killed while at a train store, and Silvio is put in a coma. And this affects Tony really badly, because at the end of the second last episode of the season, they go to a safe house, and Tony's really surrounded by not really much really well-knowns. Other than Paulie, he's not really surrounded by that many guys. There's Patsy, of course, a guy we've seen in previous episodes. We see Carlo, another guy. But that's really it. So most of his top guys are gone. Hell, early in the season, Eugene, a gangster that was made in the same episode Christopher became a made guy, pretty much commits suicide because he wants to go down to Florida, retire, but they won't let him. He tries to be a rat, doesn't, and hangs himself. Speaking of rats, in this season, we get the death of Raymond, who was a gangster we've seen in previous seasons, and a top capo. Again, we find out in the last season that he's actually a rat, an informant, and he dies courtesy of a heart attack. I think it was last season. I think it was. And ironically, when they go to his funeral, one of the guys says that he's the last of a dying breed, and they don't know the irony that he's actually a rat. Ironically, the guy that was, speaking of, gangsters, the guy from last season, I don't think I said his name, but I think it was Rusty, might be his name, who was, the capo manipulating Carmine to be, that during the war, the gang war, the power vacuum in the last season gets killed this season during Johnny Sack's wedding. And basically, just to jump forward, we kind of end the series with Tony being, a dark, evil guy who is who is barely recognizable to how he was really earlier in the series. And that goes to great storytelling, how we see a character devolve, but devolve with a purpose. And again, Gandolfini deserves every award, every accolation, and all the credit to creating probably one of the most iconic characters, anti-heroes in television history. The final episode of the series is called Made in America. Basically, the premise is New Jersey is hunkered down, in a gang war with the current leadership of the Lupatazzi family, and most of Tony's top guys, Silvio's in a coma, Bobby's dead, and he's trying to save himself and what's remaining of his crew, and he does. He manages to save it. What I like in the aftermath is we get to see really what's happening to the family, it's affected. And we get a callback to the famous line at the end of season 1 is, if you're lucky, you'll only remember the good times. Junior is unfortunately in a mental ward, the dementia really taking effect. Janice has become exactly like Olivia. And, Tony is trying to help his son, get a better life because his son wants to join the military. But he manages to get a more cushy gig in a movie studio thing. Meadows getting married. What I like is we see how devolved Tony's become from this more light-hearted, average Joe. True, he's a gangster, but he had this likable quality. But now he's come almost this sociopath, narcissistic, almost complete monster. He resembles nothing to what he was earlier in the season. Also, he's kind of, even though like he won, he kind of lost, and this is what I mean by that. Even though now this episode was for I think a while considered the worst finale in TV history. I disagree. I love the finale, how it's shot, the final go to black. I'm spoiling that, but I kind of have to because it's that infamous. My problem with the finale is, why would you have Tony winning when he really lost? Think about it. His crew's in shambles. He's about to go on trial. He's really finished. The crew is destroyed. That's my problem with the finale. I just don't get that bit. It just doesn't make a full lot of sense to me. I do love the creative choices that the Java Chase and his team went with here, because they are great creative choices. But I just feel like it's not all perfect. I feel there was a lot of flaws they did. But hey, personal opinion, okay? So let's not get that fully angry. Again, I'm not going to fully spoil too much because the Go to Black is really creative as they're showing like what really happened. It's up to an audience perspective. But for me, it's alright, I guess. The finale is definitely not the worst. It's not the best. It's a good finale, but I have my criticisms, so that's why it's in the middle category for me. But it's still a decently good episode, considering Season 6 is not really my favorite season of the series. And there we have, that was part 2 of The Sopranos. We're not really done filling the review for the series, as I want to do the movie before I give my overall review on the entire series, because I decided let's include the movie in to really finish everything up. So stay tuned for part 3. Sorry it took long for part 2, but I was going through some problems around this time, and I was in the mood to get this done, get part 2 done, and hopefully by the end of this week, if things go well, I should get part 3 and hopefully some more videos. So yeah, this has been the Steven Hour. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. I hope you enjoyed my thoughts on the seasons. And ladies and gentlemen, until part 3, so long for now.